Hey guys, welcome back for the final lecture on World War II. Today we are going to end the war in the Pacific Theater, and we'll talk about one of the hardest decisions that any human being has ever had to make, and that is the decision to drop the atomic bomb on the Empire of Japan. We will also wrap up the war by talking about some major decisions that happened immediately following the war. If you remember back to our World War I unit, we recognized the horrible choices that were made that led to the Treaty of Versailles and frankly, directly led to the conflict 20 years later. So the leadership that are the victors in this war are going to attempt to try and avoid that. We're going to talk about some efforts they made to offer long-lasting peace following the war. But the point we're going to pick up at, Japan is not yet defeated. The war may have very well raged on for months, if not years, had action not been taken. Of course, we know the end of the story. We know how the war does come to an end with the dropping of the atomic bomb. But I really ask that as you listen to this, you really put yourself in the time and place of this world in 1945 and the decision that Harry S. Truman was faced with, because he knew that just even one bomb, for the first time in the history of humanity, we have the power to destroy an entire city with a single bomb. That's an amazing power. And I know this graphic behind me, I'm kind of covering it up here. Just the destructive power of the atom bomb was something that the world had never seen and would truly change how warfare was fought from here on out. Now, thankfully, there have not been any atomic bombs or nuclear bombs dropped in war ever since. There have been many tests, of course, but no bombs have been dropped in wartime. And thankfully, that will always remain the case. But we will also discuss the threat that nuclear bombs still have today, because there are more bombs really than practically ever before. And frankly, in the hands of very few individuals that control the keys to those bombs. So with that being said, let's go ahead and pull up our screen. It has our notes on it. And give me 1 second. All right. So here we go. Again, where we've left off here, we just finished with our last lecture talking about the defeat of Nazi Germany and the end of the war in the Pacific. That was back in May. Over the next few months, as attention began turning towards the Japanese, you might think, well, surely they assumed that the gig was up, that it was time to quit. That was not necessarily the case. We have not necessarily talked too much about Emperor Hirohito, but as a young man, he as we said, he was the de facto leader of Japan. Tojo, the Prime Minister Tojo, was making many of the political and military decisions that kept them in this war. There is no there's no talk of surrender immediately. I will say that the Japanese do offer at one point a conditional surrender. President Truman is unwilling to accept that conditional surrender. I don't know how much of it played off of, the fact that the Nazis had unconditionally surrendered, but Truman being a veteran of World War I himself, he understood he did not want another war on the horizon in another 10, 15, 20 years. So we're going to put things in place to try and prevent another war from happening. But let's take a look at the events themselves. We had, I think my PowerPoint might be, I've updated it a little bit here. So we had talked last about some of the battles and specifically the strategy that the Americans are using to defeat the Empire of Japan, the island hopping campaign. And we've gotten to the point now where we put a lot of pressure on Japan. One key battle, and I want you to know, just like we talked about the Battle of the Bulge last time, the last-ditch effort of the Japanese came in a battle called the Battle for Leyte Gulf. Now, this battle The Japanese were reeling at this point, October 1944. So, I mean, there's still about a year left, just a shade under that. But this is the moment where the Japanese realize that the Americans are putting pressure on them with this island hopping campaign, and that it is time to do something and throw everything they have at the Allied forces. They had suffered their first land defeat at Guadalcanal. And so, they're recognizing they have to do something here in order to push back against this offensive weapon that is the United States Navy. In this battle, what we are going to see is it takes place over the course of 3 days. For the Japanese, they would throw pretty much everything they had at it, and frankly, they would lose most of it. Over the course of 3 days, they will lose 3 battleships. They will lose 4 aircraft carriers, 13 heavy cruisers, and 400 planes. Okay? They're going to lose 400 planes in this battle. Since we're talking about Japanese Air Force and the Navy in particular, one thing that I always have students ask about is the use of kamikaze fighters. Of course, the Japanese did, of course, use kamikaze fighters. And for those who are unfamiliar with the term, kamikaze is basically a suicide pilot, a suicide plane attack. They would use the plane as basically its own weapon, and they would slam the plane into the side of a battleship or aircraft carrier, attempting to sink it or kill as many people on board as possible. There is, I guess, what I would refer to as a common myth about kamikaze pilots. While it is absolutely true that the Japanese did use them, and frankly, we have on record there were 424 attempts of kamikaze pilots to sink ships. I think one myth about that, though, is that they were being used throughout the war. There's just not as much evidence about that as the fact is that they used them at the very end of the war. You think about it, I mean, really, it's logistically, it doesn't really make much sense as an overall strategy, right? Because every time you send up a kamikaze fighter, you lose both an experienced pilot and a plane. Well, that's not a long-lasting strategy at all. So what we really see are kamikaze pilots make their appearance in the latter stages of the war. And frankly put, they weren't that successful. All told, of those 424 kamikaze pilots that we know of, they only sank a total of 16 ships. And they did damage to a number of others, including a total of about 80 ships were damaged from it, but only sinking 16 ships. It's not a very good strategy if you're trying to win a war, but it is a desperate strategy. And that is the point that we've arrived with the Japanese Empire. They are desperate. Now, unknown to the Japanese at the time, the Americans were working on a secret weapon. This had a code name of the Manhattan Project. So for your note's sake, the Manhattan Project was a top secret U.S. project to develop an atomic bomb. I am not a scientist, so I'm not going to get into the science behind it, but the splitting of the atom, they realized, harnessed so much potential energy that if they could, basically contain this in a bomb, they could potentially level entire cities. In fact, when they first started experimenting with it, they didn't know what the ramifications were. They didn't know if this would set off a chain of reaction. In fact, there were hypotheses that they would set off a chain of reaction like in the skies, like that it could literally end the entire world. They knew that this was a very, very powerful weapon. The reason the Manhattan Project was named that, you might think, well, it was obviously in New York. This was actually another ploy to try and get our enemies to think something else. The Manhattan Project primarily took place underneath the football field at the University of Chicago. So it did not take place in New York. There were a couple components of the Manhattan Project, including testing in places like the southwest part of the United States in the desert. But the development, I should say the main engineer behind this was a man named J. Robert Oppenheimer. And if you're looking for an interesting biography, he's a fascinating man because he will be the main scientist that helps develop this thing. But from what I have seen, I think Oppenheimer actually regretted his decision, and he understood how this advancement, yes, it would end the war, but at such a tremendous loss of life. Um, that is something that Truman struggled with in his decision to drop the bomb, and it's something that we still debate to this day whether it was necessary to end the war. Some historians like to point to the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that Japan had offered a conditional surrender that we were denying, but others said, "Listen, if you don't do this, we're going to have to take other actions, including a possible invasion." So I've arranged a simplified chart at the bottom of your screen here. I would like you to copy this chart down. So let's take a look at, the pros and cons of both dropping or not dropping the bomb. Starting with the pro of dropping the bomb. And these are obviously pretty powerful points, being the fact that we did end up dropping the bomb. First of all, undoubtedly, it seems like this would end the war. If Japan realized that we had such a powerful weapon that they would no longer be able to fight against us, we would level their entire country. And who's going to continue fighting in the face of that? Number two might actually seem a little strange, but in the long run, some policymakers were saying that by using these bombs, we could actually save lives. Now, not the lives of the Japanese people, but instead the lives of American soldiers. Because if we do not drop the bombs, we will most likely have to lead an invasion against Japan. You look at, how deadly D-Day was, or how deadly the invasions of Italy were. That the Japanese are going to fight to their dying breath. And there were some policymakers that were suggesting that if an invasion of Japan was going to take place, that the United States would lose upwards of 1 million soldiers in an invasion. I think that probably more so than anything else was the deciding factor in President Truman's mind, that by dropping these bombs, we could perhaps avoid an invasion to where we put, and this is at the very end of the war, Nazis are gone. I mean, it would just seem almost fruitless. He would seem like a butcher if he did that. So to prevent the tremendous loss of life of American souls, that ultimately the atomic bomb would be used. Now, obviously, there are major cons to the bomb, and the biggest con of all is that this is what we call an indiscriminate weapon. I mean, you drop it in a certain location, and they picked cities that had industrial importance. They were not the most populated cities, but ultimately, you can't drop the bomb without killing civilians. Everything would be leveled in the cities that it was dropped, and that includes men, women, children, animals. I mean, everything would be gone, incinerated, and those that were on the kind of on the cusp, they would deal with radiation poisoning that would create cancers. So, like I have said throughout many lectures, we always like to put nice little bookends at the beginning of a conflict and at the end of a conflict. History doesn't work like that. And for the people that survived the atomic bomb, many of them dealt with very painful scars, and they dealt with cancer sometimes a decade or two later from the radiation spilling out from these bombs. So killing civilians, I know that weighed heavily on Truman's heart, and ultimately, the decision was made that this was a sacrifice that had to be made to protect our own men, but also the fact that there was this pressure that, listen, the Japanese are the ones that started this. Remember Pearl Harbor, right? Remember, they are the ones that came to us and attacked first. That why should our men sacrifice their lives when a much fewer number of the population that led to this war, it seemed like a worthy sacrifice. I'm not here to convince you otherwise. I'm just here to tell you both sides of the story. So many people today agree with the dropping. Many people do not. Let's look at the pros and cons of not dropping the bomb. Well, The major pro here, and one that would be very important later on, is that it does set a precedent. A precedent meaning that we have this capability, but we are not willing to use it, or we understand the destruction that it could cause. And frankly, I mean, it was inevitable that another country would eventually develop this technology. And so, developing some kind of restraint, the fact that no, we will not use these weapons in warfare. That was an important piece. To flash forward and foreshadow to less than 10 years from now, we're going to get involved in another conflict called the Korean War. And the main general in that war, Douglas MacArthur, he is pleading with Truman to drop an atomic bomb on China. That would have devastating consequences, I think, for world history had Truman allowed that to take place. So I'm thankful that he did have this idea of nuclear constraint, even though he was the only one that gave the order to drop them, and the only person in wartime history to do so. But setting a nuclear constraint, precedent of nuclear constraint, I think is a very, very important part that was weighed heavily. The con, of course, if you don't drop the bomb, the war continues and Americans will continue to die. So that's an important piece of this. So let's take a look at exactly what decision was made and how it went down here. The dropping of the atomic bomb. On the morning of August 6th, 1945, a plane took off from an aircraft carrier named and the plane was called the Enola Gay. That was the name of the airplane. And it was carrying a bomb on board that had been codenamed Little Boy. This plane flew over the city of Hiroshima, Japan, and released its bomb over that city. And immediately following that, the city, was of course leveled. All the people within a few miles of Ground Zero were incinerated. The blast, hotter than the sun. In fact, it gave off so much light that there's actually places in Hiroshima where shadows were permanently etched into the concrete. That is how much heat was being given off by these atomic blasts. Even in the face of all that destruction, the Japanese Empire refused to stop. And so 3 days later, the decision was made to release a second bomb, this time targeting the Japanese city of Nagasaki. And this codename was Fat Man, given the size of the bomb. After the two bombs were dropped, approximately 200,000 civilians lay dead as a result of injuries and radiation, which would continue to poison people for years after this. And the Japanese realized that they would not be able to compete with the United States military at this point, and that the gig was up. They do ultimately surrender on board the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945. The ship made its way into Tokyo Bay peacefully, and the Japanese did sign an unconditional surrender. And you can see a picture of that event taking place in the bottom left-hand corner. September 2nd would be known as Victory Over Japan Day, VJ Day, and this marked the end of World War II. Celebrations throughout the streets of every major city in the world. This was the most horrible and most destructive war in all of human history, and it had finally come to an end. It was worthy of celebrating. Now, sadly, of course, a tremendous loss of life here at the end. One thing I did not mention in my notes, but it is worthy if you were planning to study this topic in the future, is that we had been bombing Japan for quite a long time. In fact, we had developed a technique called firebombing, and these firebombs, as they tore through, they were basically incendiary bombs that basically like dropping gasoline on a fire. The wooden cities of Tokyo and all these others they just burned to the ground, and many people suffocated and died, were burned up. And this is all preceding the atomic bomb. So, I think that's also something we have to take into account when we look at, whether the nuclear bombs, the atomic bombs were the right thing to do. We've already had, frankly, in some ways, much worse, harsher policies in place before this to try and eliminate the threat. So again, whether the dropping of the atomic bomb was right or wrong, that's up to each and every person to make their decision on that. But ultimately, it did bring about an end to the war. And as I alluded to in the introduction, that did not mean that all decisions had been made. Before I get to the final slide here, I think great side-by-side pictures here. Hiroshima on the left, you can see just the basic layout of the city there. And you can see the destructive power, starting from ground zero, moving outward. The entire town, the entire city is level to the ground. It's evaporated at ground zero there. In our next unit, Cold War, we will take a look at some nuclear simulations, and we'll look at what effect nuclear bombs would have on even places like Kansas City. So let's talk about the final decisions that were left to be made. Again, no one wanted the situation that developed out of the Treaty of Versailles. People were looking for a peaceful conclusion to this. But yet there were a number of difficulties in place, maybe not from Germany or Japan, but frankly, we knew that another war was on the horizon with the growing power of the Soviet Union. Now that they literally are, they occupy the entire Eastern Europe corridor. So, there were some decisions that had to be made with that in mind. So kind of keep that in mind as we go through these. The Allied powers got together, and this was actually during the war. This was before FDR actually passed away. But I include it here because this was where they made one major decision that would be fulfilled in the city called Yalta. And here you had Roosevelt, the British leader, Winston Churchill, and then Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. They met to discuss plans for after the war. Things were starting to go well for the Allies, and they wanted to make sure that they were on the same page as this thing began to wrap up. The biggest takeaway from Yalta that I'd like you to remember is that this is where it was decided that an organization needed to be created to help keep the peace. I will remind you, during our World War I unit, we talked about how this was attempted before, and that the League of Nations, very similar in its makeup. The idea was a peacekeeping body made up of all the nations of the world as representatives. But there were some major flaws with that one. Number one, many of the big nations at the time didn't even get involved, including the United States. It was our idea, and we still didn't sign on to the League of Nations. Also, there was no military branch to it, so when nations like Japan and Germany began invading, we saw how weak that made the organization earlier on. So, they're going to avoid those problems in the future. But the United Nations would come out of this conference. And after the war, it is instituted, and it still stands today. So this is a pseudo-global government in which all the nations of the world, I'll put a little asterisk on that. There's just a couple that don't participate. Vatican City, I know, is one of those, and not wanting to get tied into any military conflicts. So there are a few exceptions, but almost all the nations of the world are involved in the United Nations. And of course, it's not without its flaws. There are many issues with the United Nations, but many people agree that they have worked to try and keep the peace over the last 60, 70 years. The other issue that had to be solved after the war was, what do we do about the Holocaust? Because you had a lot of Nazi officials, those that had not committed suicide in the underground bunkers of Berlin. You had a number of Nazi officials that needed to be held accountable for the mass murder of 11 million people. A city was selected to hold uh, war crime trial, and that city was Nuremberg, and I think that's quite fitting. If you remember back in 1935, a series of laws coming out of Nuremberg, Germany, which were the first to strip Jews of their civil and property rights. It all returns back to Nuremberg at this point, and you have a number of high-level Nazi officials who are placed on trial. You can see a picture of the trial down in the bottom of the screen. Hermann Goring, who is the leader of really the number 2 in Germany, and he was the leader of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. They had their day in court. They were able to testify, as you can see here. They were able to basically give their side of the story, but they were held accountable. 22 of the high-ranking Nazi officials were sentenced to death for their policies, and 200 others were found guilty of war crimes, and many of which served the remainder of their lives in prison. The final decision that had to be made dealt with the occupation of Japan. Japan was, in both cases, I guess, Germany and Japan, you've dealt with an entire society that has basically been brainwashed. We knew that the end of the war transferring to peacetime, it was not going to be exactly easy. But what do you do? How do you make that transition? And also in the growing threats from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was frankly amassed in the western part of their country, dealing with the Nazis, and we wanted to make sure that we laid groundwork in Japan to where we would be the ones to occupy that nation, and we would be the ones that set the policies that frankly form the government even to this day. The United States will occupy Japan for 6 years. And during that time, we will help restore their economy. We will help build a government. In fact, they still call their constitution today the MacArthur Constitution. And Douglas MacArthur was the key leader for the U.S. side in that occupation. This is one of the most fascinating parts, I think, of the entire story, and a major lesson for us regarding, the two choices that can be made after a war. Do you continue to punish that enemy of yours, or do you do things that bring them closer to you and befriend them? World War I, we took course A. We tried to punish those, and even though Wilson had a number, the 14 points, he had a lot of great peacekeeping policies that, had they gone into place, I think we could have avoided World War II. But frankly, many of those other European nations got their way, and especially France, wanting to punish Germany for that. We go a completely different direction after this war, and thank God we did, because this does set the course for, instead of making another enemy hate us even more, creating, frankly, one of our strongest allies in the time period since. Japan today is still one of our closest allies. Brutal enemy to one of closest allies within a decade with this occupation. They had a war-torn economy that we helped out by introducing a free market economy, rapidly improving that economy, and as I said, occupying it for the better part of a decade. We would the Constitution that was put in place, introduced democracy, representative democracy for that government, for that society, and that remains in place today as well. So a tremendous lesson that we will continue to talk about into our next unit, the Cold War. And we see that we will also have similar positive relationship with Germany, especially after we institute a policy called the Marshall Plan, in which we basically spend billions of dollars helping rebuild the cities that we had in fact been tearing down over the course of the war. But we end up with a lot more friends and, of course, allies, especially in the face of the communist onslaught and the Iron Curtain descending upon Europe. Well, guys, that'll do it for our lectures on World War II. Pay attention in the coming days for the review guide, and also communication to you about the upcoming exam that we will have. For those that are watching this live at this time, this virtual teaching, this is all new to us, and we're still kind of working out some kinks with the testing and how that is all going to operate. I will communicate that very clearly with you in the future. But as always, guys, please make sure that you email me if you have any questions. I would be happy to get back to you as quickly as possible. Thanks for tuning in.